Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. My name is Annie Cahill, and I have Mr. Mark Whitby with us today. And today we're going to be talking to you guys about GIS Strategic Planning for NG9-1-1. It's everyone's favorite topic, right? So that's why there are so many of you in here. We all want to learn about this and how exciting it is. So just very quickly, do some introductions. So my name is Annie Cahill, and I'm a public safety GIS technical manager here with Datamark. I live in Virginia, and I worked in local government in Virginia for about 15 years. All of that time doing GIS support. And so my current role with Datamark is I provide general technical oversight to all of our projects nationwide. I also am essentially the lead of strategic planning for the company, as well as the facilitator of our boundary workshop services. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Annie. My name is Mark Whitby, and I'm a public safety expert, more of the subject matter side, because I spent 32 years altogether working in different PSAPs. Started as a call taker, worked my way up to director, and then the last 10 years of my career, I moved over to the administrative side of 911, started working as a database manager, MSAG analyst, and started working with MSAGs and ALLIs, and started dabbling in GIS a little bit. So I currently live in South Carolina, but I spent a majority of my career and my life in Florida.
Thanks, Mark. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. So our goals for today's session are, first of all, to discuss how Next Generation 911 introduces change to GIS strategic plans, or essentially how you should consider NG9-1-1 when you're talking about strategic planning for GIS, because many GIS departments don't currently have a strategic plan. How can we eliminate roadblocks in that planning process, especially when we're preparing for Next Gen? Introducing strategic plan considerations. So what are the things that we need to consider or give more thought to as we're planning our Next Generation 911 deployment, especially as it concerns GIS data? Stakeholder roles, responsibilities, and collaboration, which is huge. Business and process workflows in Next Gen 911, and then talk about the data quality, completeness, and ongoing maintenance that we're going to need to have going forward in that environment, and then of course talk about our next step considerations. So the important thing to note here is that Next Generation 911 really cultivates a new challenge for everyone. Okay, this is really a new space for many of us. I was kind of involved in the educational process when I worked for local government. Virginia did a really good job of educating people about Next Generation 911, but the reality is that not everybody has the same resources nationwide, right? So if you're in the GIS space and your only experience has been in planning, you may not really have that public safety perspective, and therefore you may not have that educational background about Next Gen, and so this is going to be more of a challenge. Similarly, if you're in public safety, I mean, this is your space, you know about Next Gen, but you may not know about GIS. So these are definitely some gaps that we need to bridge. So when we talk about successful strategic planning, the first thing we need to really talk about is having clearly defined goals. Okay, the journey is really made better when you fully understand the destination. Okay, Next Gen really is a destination, and it's kind of an ongoing thing. Even when you feel like you reach the readiness, you still have to be able to maintain your data at a certain quality. A lot of people don't understand what Next Gen is, and a lot of people think, well, if I have text to 911, that means I'm Next Gen ready. No, that's a component of Next Gen 911, but that's definitely not the whole of things. All right, so when we talk about setting goals, we really need to look at all of the different components involved. And I'll tell you that in any Next Gen 911 deployment, the heavy lift is not in the hardware, the software, the call taking equipment. It's always in the GIS data. Okay, and for the GIS folks on the call today, many of you, especially if you're kind of old school, I mean, I've been in GIS for a really long time now, but most of us know that GIS really emerged out of the field of planning and zoning, right? Because that's how GIS software was developed. It was developed for land use services. And many localities are still maintaining their GIS data for planning. And that's the business need, right? So that's been the demonstrated business need throughout kind of like these last few decades. And so what does it take to get the GIS data ready? And how do we know what it takes? So that's where we have to create goals, right? So collaboration. Strategic planning for NextGen 9-1 involves engaging with people that you may not currently work with. So how many people in GIS have a good working relationship with public safety and understand how your GIS data is being consumed in those systems, or is it? Public safety people, how do you know who your GIS people are and how that data is maintained? And how do you know if the GIS data is ready to support NextGen 9-1-1? Have you been on that journey together? Have you had those conversations? So collaboration is a really big deal. Do you know who your addressing authority is? Sometimes the addressing authority is the same as GIS, sometimes it isn't. And what are the risks in having an addressing authority be an agency that's not GIS or public safety? What are the risks there? So these are all questions that we need to ask, right? This is where the collaboration is really big. Communication, this kind of goes hand in hand with the collaboration, but we have to have communication, very clear communication, especially when we talk about establishing roles and responsibilities towards successful achievement of our goals. Also, education. NextGen 9-1 is new for a lot of people, okay? And it's like I said before, some states are further along than others, and that's okay. The education component is huge because at the end of the day, people don't know what they don't know. Okay, and part of strategic planning involves asking those really difficult questions, right? It involves taking a critical look at how we've been doing things and how we need to change things to facilitate a better workflow going forward. Okay, so a lot of times you're going to be talking to people about the way things need to change, and these may be workflows that people have had for decades. Okay, so it's kind of a hard sell to just tell someone, hey, the way that you've been doing things for the last 10 years, guess what? We got to change it now. So I feel like if you have that upfront education, it's better for everyone when you call people to the table and you say, hey, look, this is for public safety, this is for citizen safety, and this is why we have to make these changes. Okay, so education is key. So successful strategic planning really involves getting out of our own little bubble. I know a lot of times when I was working in local gov, you know, I was the only person supporting my locality. And so I had my own stuff going on, and I rarely was thinking about how my data was being used in other operations. I just knew, okay, I give you my data and you guys do what you need to with it. Well, that's not good enough for NextGen. Okay, there needs to be better collaboration, better communication. We have to get out of the siloed environments that we're in currently. Okay, and we need to build these crosswalks and bridge these gaps between departments. How many GIS people have taken a tour of the PSAP? How many of you have gone over to your PSAP or to your dispatch center and seen how your data is used in real time? Okay, similarly, public safety people, how many of you guys have gone over to your GIS office and really sat with your GIS people and seen how your data is maintained? How many of you know your addressing workflow? If you're not the addressing authority, how do you know what that workflow looks like? You have to know all of this stuff to build a strategic plan, okay? All right, so when we talk about supporting communication at every level, so the idea behind creating a strategic plan is not only in achieving the NextGen 9-1 readiness as far as our data, but also creating sustainable workflows, right? So once we get the data to where it needs to be, what do we need to continue to do to keep up the quality and completeness? Okay, so sustainable workflows in our business processes and data. The data ultimately supports a larger network. Okay, so although the data maintenance and provisioning occurs at the most local level, and it's very critical to ensure that we continually validate our GIS data to ensure the quality. The point is that it's not just about us, right? So you have this kind of network of networks. And I know, Mark, you can speak to that a little bit better than I can, because this is more on the public safety side.
Yeah, and like Annie was saying, a lot of this is GIS, but it's also the network itself. So if a county is going to install an EZInet for a county, maybe they have the funds to do that, they have the technology, maybe they get grant funding, something along those lines. But you may start at the local level, but eventually you're going to partner with your counties that surround you. So you may actually have a regional type EZInet. So you may start with one county, or multiple counties may get together and say, we all want to move to an EZInet. And sometimes working with your vendor, you can get a better deal or better cost because they're putting in a bigger network. And eventually each region's going to be able to connect, and so on and so on. And pretty soon it's going to be like a statewide deployment. The entire state will be on an EZInet. And then our goal is to go national. So with NextGen, we want to be able to transfer a phone call from Florida to California with the data intact, because we can't do that now. We're transferring 911 calls maybe to a couple counties over, but we have to transfer it on a 10-digit line. And then for those states that are on the northern part of the US, you might be able to connect your EZInet to Canada. And if you're on the southern states, like Texas and California, you might be able to connect with Mexico. So it's not just the EZInet, but it's the GIS data like Andy was talking about. You want to have your local data really good, really clean, your good boundaries, no gaps and overlaps, but then you want to compare it to your neighbors. And then that neighbor compares it to the next neighbor, and pretty soon you have a statewide repository of all these boundaries, PSAP boundaries, address points, center lines, and all the smaller ESB boundaries that'll be in there. So putting all that together, sometimes like Annie talked about with silos, 901, we kind of think about our county, or maybe our county and the two counties we talk to a lot. We're now reaching out to multiple areas, and it's going to be nationwide and even international.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so when we talk about developing a strategic plan and what are the steps that we need to do, the first obviously is going to be to identify your stakeholders, okay? And this really involves, again, a look at all of the different workflows that go into what will ultimately support Next Generation 9-1-1. So we have to have an understanding of the data that's required. We also have to understand who's involved in maintaining that data, and then also who's involved in that addressing and road center line workflow. Okay, so if you know who your addressing authority is, you're going to need to engage them in that conversation. Okay, and if someone is in the planning department and they're the ones who are responsible for approving those road center lines, you're going to need to engage them as well. Okay, your GIS staff, those people absolutely need to be engaged. All of these different people that you may not have thought of before are really the ones who need to come to the table. Okay, so you really have to do an assessment of who your staff is throughout the departments, and determine who are the ones who are going to be supporting Next Gen 9-1-1 ultimately. Okay, and the types of conversations that need to be held. So gathering the information then becomes very, very important. It's almost like a SWOT analysis. So the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's kind of the idea here, right? So you're meeting with these individual people. You're determining what the workflows are. You're figuring out what the responsibilities are, and basically just compiling all the information. You may want to consider sending out surveys. Maybe you work in a very large locality with a huge GIS department. It would be okay to send out a survey. Similarly with public safety, maybe you have multiple people who report addressing discrepancies back to the addressing authority. A survey is totally fine, but you have to gather that information in order to have a good starting place, okay? So the other thing is a needs assessment. How do we determine what our needs are? Well, the needs assessment essentially comes from your gap analysis, okay? And your gap analysis is really what you want to do for your GIS data, okay? And also your workflows. And I'm going to kind of put a little virtual asterisk here because it's important to understand that there is a level of knowledge and expertise here that's required that many of us who work in local government may not have. Now, this begs the question, okay, especially if you are one GIS person supporting an entire locality, how do I know? How do I know if my data is good enough? How do I know about my workflows? You know, how do I know if my addressing workflow is okay? We've been doing it this way for 10 years. Is it okay? I don't know. How do I know that? And it may be time to ask the question, do I need to call on someone for help? Okay. And so that's where someone like us would come in. We could definitely help assess your workflows, assess your data, and compile all of that into one plan and then make recommendations accordingly. But I just wanted to point that out, that there are resources available because this does involve such a very, very specialized level of knowledge and expertise. And many of you who are providing that singular point of contact for your entire locality, you may not have the time, right? You may not have the time to dedicate to learning about all of this. You just want to get your data ready and get it to a place where you can continue maintaining it and continue validating it, and you're good to go. And that's totally fine, okay? But for those of you who are going to go at it on your own, it is a substantial investment in time to learn about the requirements for Next Gen 911, and subsequently get that data prepared, all right? And the workflows. And also, I should point out, and this is from my own personal experience working with all of our clients nationwide, sometimes it's really helpful to have that third party come in as the critical eye, because the voice, I feel like, is heard louder, because then you have a document that you can take to your administration and say, hey, look, these are the experts in Next Gen 911, and this is what they're telling us that we need. Maybe you need another staff member. We can write that into your plan. And I feel like it holds a little bit more weight when it comes from a vendor who specializes in Next Gen 911 readiness like we do, okay? So you want to conduct your gap analysis. You want to see where your data is at. You want to look at the quality of your data and the completeness, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. You also want to determine any deficiencies or needs, like we just mentioned, staffing. Do you have a staffing issue? Can you keep up with your existing workload? These are all a lot of different things that we need to consider, okay? And then, of course, looking at our next steps, like what can we do? Where do we start with all of this stuff? So for stakeholders, everyone is potentially a stakeholder in Next Gen 911, okay? So right now, it's really limited to police, fire, EMS, and 911, right? Like we traditionally think of public safety stakeholders. If you're in public safety, then you're a public safety stakeholder. But essentially what Next Gen 911 does is it actually adds additional people to the list of those who are potentially public safety stakeholders, right? So your addressing may come out of your planning department, but Public Works may manage approving the street center lines and the names. Okay, so they essentially become stakeholders. Similarly, GIS and IT, a lot of times GIS and IT are in the same department, so they are potential public safety stakeholders. So what is a stakeholder? I mean, obviously it's going to be anybody who contributes to those main workflows as far as your addressing process, your road center line process, or your GIS data prep. But the other thing is thinking about people who can contribute to your data completeness. And that's what I think a lot of people don't think about. We all may or may not have an address points data set, but how do we know how complete that data set is? A lot of us may be insecure about our subaddress management because subaddresses are one of the most mismanaged parts of addressing in local government, okay? So how can we contribute? How can we use these different stakeholders to contribute to our data completeness? Are there databases or resources in some of these other departments that can help us flesh out the data that we already have, because we want it to be the most complete and the most accurate possible? Okay, so it's not just about the actual workflows themselves, it's about who can contribute to making our data the best that it can be. So part of the information gathering involves learning what everyone's roles and responsibilities are, okay? This is really important. You need to know who your addressing authority is and what their actual responsibilities are, okay? And a lot of that might come from the ordinance. Maybe you have an ordinance, maybe you don't. Maybe you have one, but it's loosely followed, or you just don't know. All of this stuff is important, okay? Again, you need to assess the workflows and the business processes. So one of the things that we do is we always assess the addressing life cycle. What does that process look like from the time that the request is initiated all the way through when it becomes an official address, it's entered into GIS, and it becomes provisioned into public safety systems? Similarly, what does the discrepancy process look like? What if someone goes out to respond to an emergency and they can't find the house? How does that get resolved, and what's the time frame there? Because that's very important. We also take a look at the road centerline life cycle. Is public safety being engaged in that process? Do you have duplicate road centerline names? Do you allow duplicate names? Are you following the USPS standards for publication 28? Do the people who approve your road centerlines know what the requirements are and best practices? So this is all stuff that we assess when we go in to do a strategic plan. You know, I mentioned earlier about the subaddressing. Subaddressing is, again, the most mismanaged, one of the most mismanaged things that we see in the entire addressing life cycle. The second most mismanaged thing is municipality addresses. How many of you are working in a big locality and you have these smaller municipalities that act as their own addressing authority, but you may have just black holes for their addressing, or maybe you haven't received addressing updates in years? This is all stuff that we look at, okay? So again, when we talk about silos and we talk about collaboration and bringing different stakeholders to the table, your addressing authorities within your municipalities are absolutely stakeholders. You have to get them to the table, especially if you're dispatching resources into those municipalities. They are stakeholders, okay? We also look at the public safety workflows. What does it look like when GIS data is provisioned into those public safety systems, into the 911 system, into the CAD system? Who's managing the MSAG and ALI? Because we know in Next Gen 9-1-1, the MSAG and ALI are going to go away, but it's going to be some time until that happens, okay? So you're going to have to continue to manage and maintain your MSAG and ALI and ensure that those data sets also match and answer the same questions that your road center lines and your address points do. Okay, and then of course the GIS aspect of that gathering information is the availability of that data. What does the quality look like? What does the schema look like? And for the non-GIS folks on the call, when we say the schema, what we're referring to is the information that lies behind the data. Okay, so we're talking about essentially, to really simplify it, essentially the rows and columns that are associated. It's almost like an Excel file that you would see information about every individual street center line segment or every individual address point. And then also, how is that data used within your locality and who are the editors? So when we talk about data quality, there's lots of different facets to this. So a long time ago, and I say that, you know, it was 2009 was that NINA document. It talked about 98%. You have to have 98% accuracy. And that 98% was referring to the synchronization between the MSAG and ALI information and the information in the GIS data, but it was only looking at the databases. It was not looking at any of the spatial characteristics at all. Okay, and of course there are many, many, many facets to data quality from a spatial standpoint, right? That's why we run topology on data. There's lots of different aspects that go on there. But the first thing we want to look at is Is the data available? Do I have the data? Do I have the core data sets that are required? And I'll tell you what those are. Road center lines, address points, your provisioning boundary. And the provisioning boundary is like a geofence area. It's your area of responsibility around the data that you're required for provisioning into the EZUNet. The PSAP boundary, individual service boundaries for fire, law, and EMS. Okay, and it doesn't stop there, but those are the minimums. Okay, so do you maintain all of those data sets? Most of our clients don't currently, because these are not data sets that are currently required by existing CAD systems, right? Many of you will have ESNs or ESVs or response zones, and that's okay. You can continue to maintain those, but going forward in NextGen 911, you will have to have individual service boundaries. You can't have them all in the same data set. Individual service boundaries for those 3 service areas. Okay, so completeness is all the data present. How do you feel about your address points data set? Do you feel like you've got all of those address points represented in that data set? Okay, and if not, what can you do? What can you do to really complete that data? What about your road center lines? Do you guys just manage highways, or do you have secondary roads? You know, there's a lot of different aspects to the completeness. Okay. Similarly with completeness, we also talk about the schema. Again, going back to the schema, NextGen 911 requires a level of granularity in our data that many of us are not currently maintaining. Now, as far as the address points go, we can actually maintain that data down to the seat level. Now, I'm not saying that you guys need to do that, okay, because that's quite an undertaking, but I'm just letting you know that it's a possibility, okay? You can maintain that data down to the seat level, but at a minimum, you should have the minimum required address elements. So it's looking at that schema as well. Am I maintaining all of the required data? Are you currently maintaining the county and the country and all of that? Because you need to as part of NextGen 911, and that's all in the NENA standard, okay? Is the data accurate? Does my data reflect what's in the real world? Okay, hopefully most of us are working with aerial imagery or doing the best we can to place our address points on top of structures. That's ideal, okay? Similarly with our road center lines, hopefully, you know, we can use aerial imagery or any rights of way that are drawn into our cadastral data. We can hopefully use that to get more accurate, but there are different ways to increase the accuracy of the data. Okay, timeliness. When was the last time you updated your road center lines or your address points or your boundary data? Is it timely? Okay, in Next Generation 911, the NENA standard states that you must have any discrepancies that are reported out of the spatial interface corrected within 3 business days. Okay, now that's kind of a loaded statement and there's a lot that goes behind that, but the point is that you have to make sure that your data is timely. Okay, it requires a level of attention to the data, and really the heart and soul of call routing in NextGen is going to be the GIS data, right? So it is mission critical. And all of you GIS people out there, you are essentially essential workers for public safety with your GIS data. Okay, and a lot of people don't think of it like that, but you are considered now mission critical because of your GIS data. Okay. What about consistency? Are you using the same data everywhere? Are you working with different data sets that are of different quality and completeness? You want to make sure that everything is on the same page. All right, so when we start talking about deficiencies and needs, I would say the first thing that we need to do is start with the NENA standards. Now, there are NENA standards and there are informational documents. Okay, so the informational document for data stewardship really addresses the roles and responsibilities about managing the GIS data. Okay, but then there's also the NENA standard, which really details the structure of the data and how it should look for the civic location data exchange format. Okay, now for the GIS people out there, I would strongly recommend that you don't start there. Start with the NENA data model. Okay, don't start with the CLDXF standard unless you really need to sleep, because it will help you do that. really focus on the data model, because that's what you're going to be interacting with as GIS people, right? That's going to be a very clear cut. Here's the field name, here's the field type, here's the width, and here's what it does. Okay, and it's going to tell you if it's mandatory, conditional, or optional. Okay, so I would start there with the data model. So when you determine your deficiencies and needs, that really comes out of that initial information gathering, right? So you're with determining this, you're really bridging the gap between like what it needs to be and what it is currently. All right. So for example, if you know that you're missing different data sets that are required, you know that you need to start there, okay, and start building those data sets. For many people, your PSAT boundary will be the same as your county boundary, okay, but it's very important to engage your PSAP staff in those decisions. GIS boundaries for public safety are not GIS decisions. I cannot stress this enough. You must engage your public safety people, okay? As GIS people, we don't care. Just tell us where to draw the line, right? Just tell us where you want the boundary to be. The PSAP people are the ones who are kind of like the boots on the ground. They're the ones who are out there in real time responding to these different emergencies. And these are the boundaries that determine the call routing. All right, so engage the different stakeholders that need to be engaged to build these data sets. Okay, also looking at the legacy data. You still need to maintain your MSAG and your ALI. You'll need to maintain those data sets. And similarly, if your CAD system doesn't accept next-gen data yet, then keep maintaining the data that you already are. All right, make sure that you're maintaining that side by side. Okay, looking at the different workflows and the business processes, all of that is critical. And again, you may say to yourself, I don't even know where to start with this. I don't know how do I know if my workflow is where it needs to be? And that's where you would call someone like us to come in and help. Okay, because again, we have that level of expertise and that knowledge, and we can sit with you and examine all of this stuff and really have an unbiased look at everything and be able to make solid recommendations. All right, so after you go through this entire process, you really need to take a step back and prioritize your needs, okay? The needs are going to be different depending on the locality. All right, I can tell you a lot of the clients that we work with, they need staffing very badly. A lot of times it's a poor soul in the planning department who's overworked, you know, who's handling inspections and all this other type of stuff and doing the addressing, and, you know, they're just so stressed for resources, right? And so they definitely need someone to be able to support the public safety GIS data. And they may even investigate transitioning the addressing authority. We've made that recommendation on several occasions. You know, again, is the way that we've always done things the way we should keep doing things? And that's kind of what a third party can come in and talk to you about, okay? Really want you to take a look at succession planning. When one of your coworkers goes off and wins the lottery, do you know how to manage that addressing after that person leaves? Do you have more than one person who can update the addresses in GIS? More than one person who can update public safety systems? You need to take a look at that. You need to have succession planning, okay? The GIS data, prioritize that. You guys know, for GIS folks, you know what goes into this. Get the low-hanging fruit, right? So focus on the data layers that you don't have, okay? Maybe you have address points and road center lines, but you need to develop your boundary data, okay? So get your public safety staff into a meeting and say, hey, look, let's go ahead and build this out. Maybe I can use my county boundary as a provisioning boundary. Maybe I can use it as a PSAT boundary. Should I dissolve on my ESNs to make service boundaries for fire law and EMS? What's the best approach there? Go ahead and engage them, okay? And then start looking at some of the other stuff, right? Start building out the schemas. Take a look at that data model document from Nina and figure out what needs to go in there. While you're assessing your schemas, I would strongly encourage you to have a good understanding of what other business needs your data supports. Don't go in there and start wildly like deleting fields and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. You want to make sure that your data can still support what it needs to support right now. So if you have permitting systems or different things like that, that your GIS data is feeding, you want to take a look at those, at the schema for those particular systems and ensure that your fields can still support that. Okay, but at the same time meeting the minimums. And if you need an ETL process, because maybe your data just supports too much and it's used by too many people, then that would also be a time to assess that as well. Okay, and then of course ongoing maintenance. If you live in an area where you've got, or you work in an area where you've got a ton of development, you know, you're going to need to make sure that you're assessing your data quality frequently. The more frequently you edit, the larger areas you edit, the more frequently you're going to want to assess that data quality. Okay. And we've already talked a lot about communication and how important it is to bring these different people to the table, but that's really the first step. Okay. Especially when we start talking about people who have never been called to the table before, like your municipalities. You know, we don't want you to have black holes in your data, especially where public safety is concerned. You need to make sure that all of your address points are represented. All right. So call your municipalities to the table. I said this in a meeting last week. It always helps if you have cake or some type of snack. Bring those people to the table, individually wrapped, of course, because of COVID, or, you know, virtual, whatever you guys are doing these days. Documentation. Again, it kind of goes along with that succession planning. Your SOPs really should support that succession planning. So if something happens to one of your coworkers, you should just be able to pull up a document on your server and resume those workflows. Okay, and it's very important, especially for addressing. So many localities have these legacy addressing systems. You know, you guys, I've been in localities before where they've pulled out this poor, you know, book that's got it's just being held together by tape and a prayer. Like, it's just, you guys know, all these old addressing grids, you know, it could be on papyrus paper, I don't know, but it's old. It's really, really old. Maybe you haven't geo-referenced or digitized them yet, but make sure that you're documenting that process. If there's one person who's been there assigning addresses for 30 years, let's get that process documented and on a server so somebody can pull it up when that person retires. Okay, so you don't have to sit there and look through papers that are falling apart and faded and try to figure out how to assign an address. Okay, and then all of your different public safety systems. And Mark, what kind of documentation should we look at for public safety as far as SOPs are concerned?
Well, in your CAD system, if you're using your GIS data, then how often do you upload that data? Do you have to change anything? Like maybe the CAD only uses AV instead of AVE, which the postal standard requires. Do you have to make any changes before you upload that information? Are there certain layers that may be in the CAD that you don't normally use in other places? Your CHE or your call handling equipment, you may use a map and you may use your GIS data for that map specifically. A lot of records management systems use, and property and evidence type systems, the jail systems, they use GIS. It may come directly from the CAD, but it may be a third party that you have to load that data in for it to validate, like in your CAD system. And some places use GIS a great deal with analytics. But who uploads that information? Is it a technician? Well, what if that technician leaves? Does the next person know how to upload that data and know it has to be uploaded weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually into the different systems? So it's really important to have procedures written out for anybody who's going to be touching different things.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say the one thing that we probably haven't touched on yet is the training. In addition to the succession planning, it's really important to make sure that you have that education, that training component. Again, we're asking people to do things that they've probably never had to do before and have a familiarity with something that's a pretty foreign concept to a lot of us. Okay. You know, you may have been a GIS person for 15 years, but there are certain things about maintaining data for public safety and for NextGen that you may not be aware of. Okay. So it's really, really important to get that training. We can help with that. And really just don't be afraid to say, I don't know this, because that's really the first step, right, in getting help. And so we can definitely help with all of these things through our strategic planning process. We can also recommend different types of training for you guys. We offer training here as a company for ongoing maintenance, for validating data, et cetera. We have validation services and all that good stuff. Okay, so we will take questions. We've got about, 15 minutes for questions. Does anybody have questions or comments?
I have a whole bunch that I've been trying to answer as you've been talking. So let's go with, how do you get your addressing authority to understand the importance of a 3-day turnaround?
Yeah, again, I would say there's lots of different levels to that. So the first thing would be the education, okay? And again, a lot of your addressing authorities have been around for a long time, and it may take that discussion with administration to say, look, these people are not willing to do what needs to be done to support Next Generation 9-1-1. So maybe we need to look at transitioning the addressing authority. We recommend it all the time. I'm not convinced that addressing should always stay in the planning department if that's where it currently is, especially if that authority is very disconnected from public safety and from GIS. You can't be, right? Like we have to get out of the silos. That's exactly what we're fighting against through this process. So I would recommend starting there. Have the discussion. If they're unwilling, then take it up to the next level, because it is critically important. And the other thing is that your GIS data actually has a discrepancy agency identification associated with it. That's how the spatial interface knows who to kick the data back to. Okay, so you guys are essentially on the hook. It's going to be your PSAP who's the data steward, even if they're not the ones who are correcting the data. They're the ones who are responsible for getting that data back into the EZNet. Okay, so that's another consideration. Maybe you get your public safety people involved. So those are just some ideas.
Yeah, and one thing that we did in Pinellas County, we had our county, and then we had 24 addressing authorities within the county. So I started an addressing authority group and brought these groups together, and we met every quarter. And we talked about some of these NENA standards, especially like 3-day turnaround. So we implemented a 3-day turnaround for our addresses to come back, the information to come back. So we started it really early. We're not ready to move to next gen in Pinellas County yet, but we wanted to start that as part of that workflow process. But during our meetings, we talked about NENA standards. We talked about, what kind of issues are you having? Why is it taking you 5 days to research and address? What are your workflows? Who do you need to talk to? Maybe we can streamline some of those things. We had a couple questions about what an EZNet is, so I kind of described that. They asked about some examples of success stories about this strategic planning.
Yeah, so I would say that strategic planning as a whole, again, it's when you have goals, it helps to have a clearly defined path to those goals. And we have seen a lot of people, especially on the GIS side, really improve their data, their overall completeness, and their accuracy by going through that process of having their data assessed and then working with us to determine what needs to be a part of that data. And again, that involves us going through it, looking at how it's being maintained, looking at how the NENA standards lay out what that data model should look like, and then bridging that gap, right? So obviously, we have a lot of success with people who have been able to go beyond 98% because of the strategic planning. We do have people who have taken their strategic plans to administration, and they've gotten increased staffing. Maybe it's been a struggle. and they've been able to receive that increased staffing, and consequently not only have additional support for GIS, but also for the CAD systems. A lot of what we're seeing now is public safety people actually requesting their own GIS staff. It's not necessarily GIS departments requesting GIS staff, but it's public safety requesting GIS staff simply because the demand is so high. So we've seen success in a lot of different areas. Now, we make a lot of recommendations in our plans that are what I would call nice to have. So I do think that there is an element of people prioritizing the recommendations, which is what we obviously want them to do. We know that, a blue sky situation, you would implement everything on the list, and then you would just have everything perfect. But a lot of people are phasing it as well, and we also recommend that.
Awesome. Here's another question about zip code information. It seems that why does it require items such as zip code to be in the address point layer? It should be separated because zip code polygons are maintained separately, just like city limits, zoning, etc.
Well, because zip codes are not a required NENA layer. The required NENA layers are address points, road center lines, and then all of the associated boundary data that we talked about. So provisioning boundary, PSAP boundary, and then individual service boundaries. Zip codes can be helpful, but they are not always authoritative, and it is helpful. I believe, and I'd have to do some research to see if a zip code is required as part of that NENA schema within the model. And Mark, if you keep reading off the questions, I can look that up briefly.
Okay. There was a question about any word on federal funding sources. Well, we know, there is a federal grant out there for NextGen 9-1-1, so that includes GIS. It expires, I believe, March of next year. Now, we don't have any words about are they going to extend that because of COVID. So we're kind of waiting to see if they're going to extend federal funding. I know some states do funding. I know other places are doing different kind of things. Some agencies are, using their 911 funds and starting to budget out for things that can be done with their GIS, as well as their EZNets, and to get equipment and hardware and all the different things they need to move to NextGen. Some places are using their local funding. Maybe it's their general fund in their county or their municipality as well. But we're waiting to find out about federal funding. We hope they extend it.
Okay, yeah, and that's great. And also check out your state funding as well. A lot of states are offering funding for preparing GIS data for NextGen, which would cover a variety of services. And I just wanted to come back to that zip code question. So the zip code is actually an optional field. Postal code is an optional field within the NENA data model. So you don't have to maintain that unless you already have it. Or actually, no, it's optional, so you don't have to maintain it. If it's conditional, conditional means that if the data is already there, then you have to continue maintaining it. Optional means you don't have to. So I hope that helps.
Okay, here's
any more questions?
Yeah, here's another question. Have you had customers ask how to develop an ROI out of this process? So return on investment.
Well, I mean, ultimately, this is supporting public safety. I mean, what we're doing is we're taking a system that was built, what, Mark, in the 1950s?
Yeah.
And, we've had patches and Band-Aids on this thing for decades. And, now we're bringing it up to what office buildings are using. I mean, we're using voice over IP, and we're also able to consume other things as part of the call, such as text to 911, OnStar crash reports, video to 911, all that stuff. So I would say ultimately the return on investment is public safety. It's human life. And furthermore, this is not optional. Everyone has to do this at some point. It's just that in some states, we see a more organized effort than in others. But eventually, everyone will have to go to this because this is a nationwide system. So like we talked about earlier, the network of networks. If my PSAP fails, then somebody 500 miles away should be able to take over, right? So that's, you know, as far as dollar amounts, I mean, it is an investment, but it's public safety, which should take priority. I mean, it's really mission critical.
All right, good job, Annie. All right, here's another question. Are fire law and EMS boundaries separated in the NINA schema, or are they all part of the ESB feature class?
Nope, they are separate. So it's going to be 3 individual feature classes for you. And each of those feature classes will have an associated schema. So I'm just going to pull this up here, y'all. This is the NINA standard for Next Gen 9-1 GIS data model. So earlier in that graphic I showed you, it was actually a graphic for the civic location data exchange format. Okay, and that document really details the required elements and how those are used in Next Gen 9-1 related to the PIDA flow and that exchange of information that occurs between the data and the 9-1 system. Okay, don't read that. That's not what you're going to be interacting with. You're going to be super bored if you read that. This is so clear cut. So it tells you what the required layers are, strongly recommended and recommended. And I can walk through all of this with y'all if you want. We don't have much time on this call though. And yes, so emergency service boundaries. So at a minimum, you have to have law, fire, and EMS. But like if you're in a coastal area, you may want to consider the Coast Guard. So like we work in a lot of coastal areas like Maryland and Florida, and you know, we may have to engage the Coast Guard. You may also want to do poison control or the Forest Service or any of these different emergency service boundaries. But the minimum is these 3 right here in separate feature classes. Hope that makes sense.
All right, some people are asking if we're going to have a recording of this webinar, which I believe we have recorded it. I believe we share this out later on, we have a YouTube channel with Datamark that we may be able to share this out as well. Let me see if I think there's some other questions in the chat. So let me look at that.
Hey, real quick, I just wanted to mention that we are doing a grants webinar on December 1st, and we should have the link coming in the chat. If it's not there already, Steph is going to drop it out there. And then we're also going to send y'all who registered an email with the link to the recording.
All right, and that's now in the chat, so thank you, Steph. One person's asking, is there a basic GIS strategic planning template out there to build your own GIS strategic plan?
You know, probably, but the important thing to understand is that this is strategic planning for Next Gen 9-1-1 specifically. And honestly, there's nothing really out there that I've seen. I've been doing this now for almost 2 years. So this is it's a very unique kind of a document, because it's not just about GIS, but it's also about GIS and how it relates to Next Gen 9-1-1 as far as like the NINA standards are concerned, and what the best and most appropriate workflows are for managing that data as far as either the GIS or the addressing. So I don't know of any. There might be like a general GIS strategic plan. So you could probably just search. Sorry, I don't have anything saved though.
All right, I got one last question. Okay, in Alabama, apparently EMS was responded to by both fire and ambulance. Are there any examples of how this would work with just one EMS boundary, or ESB for EMS?
Yeah, and I think, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, we just talked to a locality earlier in Florida, and their EMS and fire are the same, but they still have to have individual service boundaries. So the way it works, guys, in NextGen is, and I don't want to get too teachy, and that because that's also what I do, is I teach GIS too. But anyway, like I'm making all these gestures with my hand, like you guys can see me. But so the way call routing works in NextGen is it's a point and polygon analysis, okay? And that point either comes from a civic location or it comes from a geodetic location, okay? And so essentially what it is is if you can envision just a point being dropped on a map, whatever polygon in which that point falls or is located, that is the PSAP who gets the call. Okay, so that's determining who gets the call. Then any service boundaries that it touches, those are the service boundaries that are used to figure out which service goes to that location. I hope that makes sense. You could see it better if there was a diagram, but that's the best way that I can tell you to visualize it. So yes, you still need those boundaries. And to add another layer to this, ultimately, you will take direction from your next-gen core services provider. And many people don't know yet who that is. Is it Motorola? Is it Trado? Is it AT&T? No, a lot of people don't know. Okay, but they may give you extra instructions regarding that GIS data. Did we have any other questions, Mark?
Nope, I think that was it.
All right, well, I hope you guys will email. Now let me go back some slides so y'all can see what our email addresses are. So there's our email addresses. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I will do my best to answer your questions. And if there's something that we can do for you guys from a strategic planning perspective, you're basically going to be just dealing with me because I'm the one who leads the strategic planning efforts for our team. And I've worked in local government for a long time, and I really, I missed it for a while. But this is just so much better because I feel like I can really reach more people across more localities. And I do have that unique perspective of being a GIS person in local government. So I do thank all of you for joining. And I do hope that you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving and be safe.
Yes, thank you very much.